everybody. My name is Claire Squires and I'm the Director of SGSAH, the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities. This is the second of our daily keynotes as part of the SGSAH Summer School, which, as many of you will know, is a series of workshop and training sessions for our PhD researcher community. I'm really delighted to be welcoming Tanja Bueltmann to talk to us at SGSAH today. Tanja is Professor of History at Northumbria University. She specialises in migration and diaspora history. Her main research interest is in immigrant community life, especially ethnic and associational culture. And in her current research, she examines the role of associations in shaping EU citizens' collective action in the context of Brexit. And Tanja herself, as I know you will all know, is a campaigner and activist herself. I'm also delighted to say that although Tanja is at Northumbria University at the moment, she will be joining the University of Strathclyde later on in the summer. So it will be wonderful to have her back in Scotland again and to be part of the SGSAH community. So thank you very much, Tanja, for joining us. Very much looking forward to what you have to say, and handing over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you for that kind introduction. Can I just have a nod? You hear me okay before I keep talking to maybe nobody? Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for having me in the first place. It's my great privilege to talk to all of you today, although of course I wish it was under different circumstances. So just in case I forget, you know, I hope you're all safe and stay safe. So it's the strangest of times. And speaking of strange times, when Claire and I talked about me giving this keynote and we set the date, I genuinely forgot what day today is. Of course, it's the 23rd of June, so 4 years ago on this day, the EU referendum was held. So in a slightly odd twist of fate, today is a very topical day for some of the things I'm going to talk about, because it is about partly about how EU citizens sprang into action effectively after that referendum and chose to pursue types of collective action very similar to some of the things I've examined. But 4 years ago on this day, yeah, I didn't think about ever making any of this a part of my research. So it is a slightly strange sort of place to be in to talk about it today specifically. So I'm going to become quite small in a second, because I'm going to start sharing my screen so that I can tell. Oh, actually now it lets me share just the PowerPoint. It didn't do that before. Let me try that and see if that works as well. So hopefully you can now see my PowerPoint. Can you still see me in small as well? Okay, brilliant. So essentially my talk today is in a way about telling you how I got from the black and white picture to the picture in color. So how I got from looking at groups like the Sons of England, which is the black and white picture, it's a lodge of the Sons of England in Canada, to trying to make a connection to the 3 Million, which is an EU citizens' rights group and association, the leading group representing EU citizens at home in the UK now and our rights post-Brexit. I will embed that in a bit of a discussion at the beginning about diasporas and what they actually are, in my view, and how I came to consider associations a useful hook in the first place, because that's not necessarily a default. You could look at diasporas, of course, in any manner of ways. And then at the end, I'm going to also talk a little bit about what this might perhaps tell us about knowledge exchange and impact activities more broadly. These are now sort of buzzwords perhaps in the academy, but I actually think they are much more than that, because they offer opportunities for us to work with people that we might not normally work with, perhaps in really innovative and exciting ways. And actually, just as an aside at the outset, to say something perhaps a little bit positive in the context of COVID-19 and the crisis we're all faced with, I think some of this sort of knowledge exchange impact work for us as historians, but also humanities subjects more broadly, is really important, especially now. So hopefully we can come up with new innovative ways of using this with other colleagues and continue to pursue the research we all pursue for the better of society more generally. But let me start with historical diasporas. So here is a picture that you may have seen before. It's quite a famous one, of a group of Scots who are about to emigrate to the Canadian West. We're sailing west, it says we're sailing west, to prairie lands sun-kissed and blessed, the crofters' trail to happiness. So it makes all sorts of implications about this movement of these people at a time when the prairie states were still being settled. There was support available for people to make their way there, and that was, of course, attractive to a lot of people, not just Scots. But one of the things that's interesting for me in the context of the talk today is diasporas are not just about the movement of people. So that's a really important thing to note right at the outset. If you're not so familiar with diaspora studies, quite regularly in popular discourse, I see diaspora and migration or immigration used effectively as meaning the same thing. They don't. I suppose if I had asked you to tell me what a diaspora is, many of you would have mentioned the Jewish diaspora or the Armenian diaspora, or perhaps slavery in the context of forced dispersal. All of these points are well made. They are what we might perhaps describe as sort of traditional diasporas that relate to forced expulsion of homelands, to very, of course, in the Jewish case, absolutely devastating wider contexts to that forced dispersal. And that's important. That's one aspect of diaspora studies that's really critical. But more recently, we are looking at other groups of people also in terms of diaspora, because they share many of the characteristics. And in that sense, this idea of forced dispersal is one of those characteristics, but it doesn't have to necessarily be there. That's also very important. But for all of these groups, it's not just about their movement in whatever way they did move. It is also about a number of other characteristics that really make them a diaspora. And I think key of them are things like forming global connections back to the homeland. So you have to have some sense of understanding or identity that there are other groups of you somewhere else there still as well. But also connections to other countries. And for that, sometimes the groups I looked at were very important. For example, celebrating St. Andrew's Day on the same day around the world is a way in which you might connect. So therefore, it's also about things like cultural traditions or identity, the foodways. You could come up with many other things that might still underpin this global community. Networks are another vital aspect. Of course, they existed also kind of parallel, sometimes overlapping to this in other contexts. Business networks, if you think of Jardine Matheson, for example, they mostly hired fellow Scots. So there's a big thing there going on about networks. Or kinship networks, family networks, they were pull factors for the movement often as well. So again, different types, but very vital that there were these network elements underpinning this further. And so associations were my focus, and I want to tell you a little bit more about why. And hopefully this will help us a bit with that. It's from my book Clubbing Together, and that's about Scots, but really I think it relates to pretty much any group. I'm really interested in the people, but I was asking myself, well, how can I sort of measure diaspora through people? Well, perhaps by looking at the structures within which they operated, or at least many of them operated. And ethnic associations are one of those structures. By no means the only one, but one of them. Another interesting one would be perhaps churches or religion more broadly. That's also a big one. But also it's about who we are talking about. So are we looking at someone who was an involuntary migrant, sold off as an indentured servant, for example, or are we looking at someone who chose to settle abroad? So really important to try and capture who we are actually looking at. I've also done a lot of work in Asia, which is very well conceptualized as a sort of sojourner, much more transient type of diaspora, where even now people are much more mobile. They only stay for a few years and then they move on. So very different contexts. And all of this we can capture through structures because they react to these contexts. And that's why, or one reason why I found that very interesting. And then there's perhaps also a question of proximity that's relevant. Are you really far away, especially in the 19th century? If you were in New Zealand, well, you know, no Facebook, no Twitter. How are you going to continue to connect with other parts of the world? Or did you just make your way from Scotland to Newcastle, for example? There was a large Scottish community here, but actually they also behaved exactly in the same way, setting up associations, doing caper tossing and all sorts of things. So these are just some of the considerations that still are valid today for lots of immigrant groups. Modern technology has made some of them perhaps less relevant, or we now have modern network facilitators like LinkedIn and all these sorts of things. I've looked at that too to try and compare to previous mechanisms of networking? So these are all very interesting questions, but that sort of is the broad, in a nutshell, the context. And I then chose to focus on ethnic associations. So clubs and societies set up by immigrants after arrival to try and capture these agents, the immigrants themselves, in these structures. And essentially, I've come up with 3 ways of looking at them. One is perhaps the most obvious one that many of you would also mention if you think, for example, of a St. George's Day celebration or a Burns dinner. They provided forms of sociability and also what I've called sites of memory, so places where you might express your ethnic identity, where you might eat haggis or sauerkraut, in my case, if we were looking at Germans, for example. So those sorts of things are definitely there. There is a sort of shortbread tin facade to these groups for Scots, but for others as well. But perhaps one function that you might not have mentioned is that actually many of these ethnic associations served very civic functions. So while their roots are definitely ethnic, German, English, Scots, whatever, their functions often went beyond that, outside of their own community bounds. And that's the key for today's talk, really. We're looking at groups who took collective action for a wider purpose that extended their ethnic bounds. And in the case of EU citizens, of course, that's kind of the case by default, because we're not looking at national groupings anyway, but a group of EU citizens already under a sort of higher umbrella term, but we can come back to that later on. So let me tell you a little bit first about my sort of traditional research and then how that relates to now. That brings me to 3 different types of collective action, really, that I want to show you to highlight the diverse roles these associations played. I'll come back to this specific picture in a minute to explain more about it and what it is. Just to say one thing at the outset, and if you have more questions about it, we can talk later. This picture shows you very well one fundamental problem with looking at historical ethnic associations. They are very male dominated. And that gets better over time. There are also specific women's groups emerging in the early 20th century, for example, based on ethnic roots. But this is just something to bear in mind, and I've written about this in my work more extensively, and it applies to actually a lot of associations at that point in time in the 19th, early 20th century or earlier. They were just not necessarily female domains, but that doesn't mean the women weren't there. They were just not visible, which is a problem, but yeah. So first of all, most of these ethnic associations that I've looked at, they started out, I mean, the earliest actually in London, when immigrants from within the British Isles moved to London and needed support there, essentially on the basis of philanthropy. So it was richer people from that community setting up groups to try and help fellow immigrants from that community in distress. So for the Scots in London, for example, they set up a Scots box, that's what it was called in the mid 17th century. And it was essentially that people would put money in the box and support types in the box, and poor Scots could be supported with that. Now through associations later on, that became more organized, and there were other ways in which that could be facilitated. And then they made their way around the globe. Here is one example from Philadelphia, from an English group, the Sons of St. George, that was set up there. And hopefully you can see this just a little bit at the top. There is St. George on his horse, and he's slaying the dragon, you know, so that's maybe the stereotypical bit a little bit. But in that banner there, it says, add to brotherly love charity. So it sort of encapsulates exactly what I've just said. The idea that you support each other, or the better off support those who are poor and need help. And at the bottom in that banner, it says, I was a stranger and ye took me in, which sort of again emphasizes that idea. So these groups were set up, English, Scots, Germans, Hungarians, everybody did this. They exist everywhere. There are massive across North America and many other places around the world. And this charity was possible, as I said, because they were better off. And so, for example, here's a picture, late 19th century, I think, of the St. Andrew's Society Ball in Montreal. These events were held, yes, to celebrate St. Andrew's Day together, but also, again, to generate additional funds for some of these other activities. So the members of these groups were these richer, better off people so that they could dispense their philanthropy. And in Toronto, that brings us back to the picture we saw earlier. This included, for example, what the St. George's Society there called Christmas cheer. They were preparing these boxes. You can see the gentleman holding one and then some more on the side, food parcels essentially for Christmas. They're chopping up meat there to include in this, and they dispensed hundreds of these in the city, and this was a very specific activity that they did. But there were lots of other things. They provided meal tickets in New York. The Scots and English societies had hospital beds that they made available for poorer immigrants. They welcomed new immigrants in Castle Garden, which is where they originally arrived in New York. All these sorts of things, a whole plethora of activities. And they did that, why? Because the state didn't. And this is really important. These groups sprang into action basically where there was a void, where the state didn't help. And that's really important also for the EU Citizens Connection in a minute. And so this was the one side, philanthropy. But then there were some offshoot activities from that went beyond that. I've still grouped it under philanthropy, but because the sort of money still came from the same people, but there were different types of activities. So for example, there were a few old people's homes. And this is one in Riverside, Illinois, and it's just one of my favorite pictures. I wish I knew who that woman is. I just love it. Someone's playing the fiddle and she's dancing. What was so special about this home isn't even so much the fact that it was founded by the Scottish Society there and funded, but the fact that it let couples stay together in the late 19th, early 20th century that was not normally allowed. And the Riverside home was one of the very few that did allow this. In fact, they expressly talk about wanting to do this. Why on earth would we want to separate old couples in their last few years of life? So it's a really interesting story. And also, just as an aside, because it still basically exists today, it has a different name, it has a less narrow focus, but they still very much value their Scottish roots. They have whiskey tasting evenings and all sorts of things like that. So maybe check it out if you're interested, because sometimes you might also find actually these connections of some of the things you looked at historically with an immediate sort of descendant in a sense now. So that's worth bearing in mind. So very different types of activities. But then a completely different new strand also emerged, and that's one based on mutualism, which is different from the philanthropy and expressly different. It was especially strong in Canada, but also in the US and South Africa to an extent. And I have an example here of the Sons of England Benefit Society, but actually the Scots had the same, the Sons of Scotland, the Germans had the Son of Hermann, or Herman. So again, it's a wider pattern. It's not specific to one group. And these groups were different because they were working class Scots. They weren't the types of people dancing at the St. Andrew's Day ball. They were working class Scots, and they actually, the founding group of this particular group, they basically came across the Toronto St. George's Society, the one I showed you before with their meat baskets, and said, we don't want this charity. There's a record of a conversation where they saw charity being dispensed from the St. George's Society office in Toronto, and they said, no, I don't want this. I want to be able to help myself. And that's how they came to form their association. And it's based on mutualism, and essentially they were like insurance companies. They basically operated like insurance companies for specific ethnic groups. They were different in character, and you can immediately see that on this photograph. Certainly the English groups, they are wearing sashes. They operated like lodges, very much akin to the Orange Order, which you might be more familiar with in the Northern Ireland context. And they were also sometimes sectarian, the Sons of England. There were more issues around questions to do with religion, for example, but that's a separate issue. If you're interested, you can look at some of the other work I've produced. There's more on that. But the main difference is this was not about philanthropy. So people were paying in themselves from their wages, and if they fell ill or if they died, they were being supported through this mechanism of what essentially was insurance. So a very different way of organizing, but the same principle. There was a void where the state or private companies didn't provide these people with what they needed, so they came up with a solution themselves. And just to emphasize this a little bit, this is some of the income of the Sons of England and the Sons of Scotland that they made from these membership fees and what they then dispensed through insurance and the number of certificates that were in force. So you can see they were pretty big. And you would make a contribution, which was normally changing over your age. So if you were older, you had to pay more because you were more likely to perhaps have more serious illness or die. And so this was the way it worked. And of course, the story is more complicated overall, but you know, they still also did these social elements though. So it wasn't just about the insurance. There were coyote hunts and also St. George's celebrations and St. Andrew's celebrations and so on. Now, the final pillar is, I've used sports here as an example, but it is wider cultural sort of activities that many immigrant groups also pursued. But again, they were able to do this within much more of a civic context that had much wider implications that were not really just about their own ethnic group. Now I come back to the gentleman in a minute. Let's look at the bigger picture first. It's from a Turnverein in the United States, in Anaheim. And this was a German thing. And now the Nazis made all the sports stuff really bad, and we know that. This is kind of prior to that, but there was always a strong tradition of physical exercise in Germany, and prior to the Nazis really turning that into something evil. This was a strong tradition in Germany, and this is an interesting picture, partly because, as you can see, it's lots of women on there, so for once here's a route in which we can actually capture some women. But this was a huge thing in the US. There were also lots of other groups that were doing different types of activities, and they contributed significantly to the development of sporting culture. So here we have ethnic groups bringing something that's quite specific to them to develop something that really became a thing in these new countries. And that brings us to the gentleman there. This is probably one of my favorite photographs, and I always try to find a way to put it in. He looks like he's wearing some diapers, I'm sorry to say, but he is a wrestling champion from Caledonian Games in New Zealand. And I wanted to just wrap this bit up by showing you the extent to which something that has ethnic roots can acquire this much wider relevance. So in New Zealand and Australia actually as well, the philanthropic angle I was talking about at the beginning, with ethnic associations being set up to help poorer immigrants, didn't really exist, especially in New Zealand. It was tiny. Why? Because New Zealand was settled much later, and the people who went there in the first place tended to be a little bit better off to begin with. So they simply didn't quite need that sort of brotherly love and charity that we saw previously to the extent that people in North America did. Of course, the volume of numbers of immigrants was also much lower, so that's maybe another factor. But it goes to show the importance of, you know, common patterns, yes, but distinct differences as well in these different locations. So the Scots in New Zealand, and largely also in Australia, they really started out not with any of that, but with Caledonian societies, that's what they called them mostly, that were primarily founded on the basis of promoting and hosting these Caledonian Games. They were usually called Caledonian Games, but it's Highland Games effectively. And at the beginning they were small, and of course it was about caber tossing and all these things, but very quickly they transformed into something that was about developing New Zealand sporting culture, and it was a significant factor in that. The games expanded in not just in size and numbers. I mean, especially if you look at these maps in the South Island of New Zealand, which is where a lot of Scots did settle. Free Church Settlement, Dunedin, the Gaelic name for Edinburgh, was big, but it expanded across the island in the centers of population, basically, and other sports were included. Running, various kinds of running, cycling became a big thing for some of them eventually. So they gained a much wider relevance. They were a big enterprise, and they were not just about sports. But these are the three areas of ethnic associations that stand out most prominently. There are, of course, lots of shades. You know, this is a shortcut story that I've given you. But this is what brings us really, in a sense, to the point about associational activism now. Because what I discovered then very quickly was that, of course, all these groups were operating in that void that I just described. They were taking action, they were being set up, they were being active, because something wasn't there or because something was wrong. They were reacting to that. They were taking this action from the grassroots up. They were building these associations. And that's pretty much exactly what happened 2 weeks after today, 4 years ago, when the first people in Bristol came together to found basically what was to become the 3 million. The fact that they came together in a pub is even better, because that's exactly what most of the groups that I've looked at historically did. That's how these groups are being born. So the overlap is significant. The question for me was, how can I actually connect that in a sensible way? Because I am also, as Claire rightly said, an activist myself. You know, I wanted to basically find a bit of a way to also do this in a professional context, because I was genuinely very interested in how this worked, because it seemed to be so similar, even though the topic and the issues were fundamentally different. So I started to work with the 3 million, not just because they represent me or anything like that, but from the perspective of them being an association, looking at the structures, how they operate, and found more and more parallels. And to try and really assess this more fully, I carried out a big survey. You may have seen this at the end of last year, which was about settled status. Now, that's the status we all have to apply to EU citizens. Just in case there's an EU citizen, if you haven't done so yet, you've got another year, please do, otherwise you will become unlawful overnight, and we don't want that. So this was about settled status, but it was also including questions about the organization, about associational structures, and critically also wider questions of identity, a sense of home and belonging, because that's also what runs through all of my work, because these associations I've looked at are ultimately also always about that. So significant, I mean, I probably hoped or thought it might be 1,000 responses or 1,500 maybe, but it was 3,171 responses, and that was just mind-blowing. Now, for academic surveys, a bigger number isn't necessarily always better. One has to say that. There are some questions about skew that potentially become more significant if you have a larger sample, but the report I prepared, if you're interested, it's available online, addresses all of those. And it certainly is significant to me that so many people replied, because it showed to me that there is a massive need to talk amongst people about the scheme and the issues. And that came out very strongly, especially in the questions connected to home and belonging, or rather a sense of unbelonging. That's what came out very strongly. And how then the actions the association, the 3 million are taking is seen within that context. So the words you can see there, people were asked to provide one word to describe how applying to settled status makes them feel. There wasn't one single positive word. So we have 3,171 words that are like this, and I calculated the weighting for them, and the bigger they are, the more frequently it was mentioned. So it's not good in that sense, and there are lots of issues. What's important about doing this kind of work, and that's of wider relevance, whatever your impact or knowledge exchange hook might be, is that you find ways to engage with people that's easy and straightforward. To give you just one example, for the survey I prepared these Twitter cards. These are basically Twitter cards, but they could be used anywhere, of course, that give you snapshots from the survey essentially, but in a really easily accessible way. So for all of you, whatever your focus of work is, you have to find these ways if you want to go beyond the sort of academic ivory tower, and you have to find the right language. That's not about dumbing down. You know, I sometimes see that, and I sometimes see other academics say that. Please don't ever do that. It's not about that. It's our job to distill this in a way that makes it accessible. At least that's what I believe. And if we can't do that at all, whether we do actual impact work or not, but you know, we have to be able to do this, I think. Many of you might be writing blogs, or you might be on Twitter, so you're actually probably already doing this in quite significant ways in the way you talk about your research. So this is just to show you one. But there are lots of other ways, and some of them I've learned through my activism in the first instance, but actually they're really great for this kind of engagement work as well. And here is one thing that I absolutely loved and have done since many, many times. It's just using post-it notes for various activities. This one that you can see there was on Trafalgar Square, where we had asked EU citizens to describe in one word how they feel. This was ages ago. It was in a more specific context, so it's different from the survey. But it got people to stop, partly because many thought it was maybe an art installation. It was on Trafalgar Square, where there are lots of artists, so that was a sort of accidental benefit which we discovered during the day. But so many people stopped, you know, these colors on the ground, what is this? And as you can see, it was summer, so obviously that helped. If it rained, I guess it wouldn't be great. But so this is one thing, and then I'm gonna wrap up after this. We did a tour together. Unfortunately, COVID-19 sort of forced us to stop that halfway through, which is really a shame. But this was about me understanding better, that was the one work part of it for me, the local kind of dimension of the 3 million. I've worked quite a bit on different types of associations. Some of them have branch systems locally. So this was about trying to work more on the structures of the 3 million and how they operate locally. So we were literally going on a tour of the UK. We started in Bristol, and then all the 4 nations we did manage to do: Belfast, Edinburgh is the picture here, and London already, of course, previously, and Bristol as the sort of English stop. There were meant to be lots of other much more diverse locations, also a very remote one, which I'm so sad that we didn't get to, Fort William, because we wanted to test how associations operate in that kind of context when there's very few people around, or they're very dispersed. So there were lots of interesting questions. And then, of course, you might try, depending on what your work is, to also maybe work with policymakers and think tanks. We can talk more. We've got a little bit of time left for some questions potentially about that. This was more of an accident initially. I was approached by a think tank to write a policy brochure for them. Obviously, you know, you could try and facilitate some of these things, perhaps just by engaging with think tanks or people you might like to work with, even if this is not something you would end up doing straight away. And many of these things, I have to say, are not plannable. They just do happen by accident. So for example, you know, suddenly on a Sunday night, I got an email from a peer from the House of Lords who said, oh, I hear there's this survey. I know it's not out yet. Can you give me a quick rundown ahead of time? We have a session tomorrow in the House of Lords, I'd like to cite it. And after checking whether we could do this confidentially, you know, these things just sort of work sometimes, and that's how it ended up in Hansard. So you can't plan everything. But I hope I've given you a little bit of an idea how perhaps it's possible to look at your research on historical issues and translate them and connect them to something that might be relevant today. I think much of our work is, and yeah, hopefully you can find your hooks perhaps, because I think as historians we have a lot to give, and if we needed any further a confirmation of that, I think now is the time with all the debate on statues and all the other things that are going on. And again, there's little to see, nothing really ultimately that's positive about COVID-19, but I hope it will facilitate historians, you know, engaging with the challenges that we will now be faced with, because we do a lot of work on communities, organizations that can help build things up again. So that's maybe a sort of positive plea at the end, but I'll stop now.
Thank you very much, Tanja. If we could all give Tanja a round of applause using the emoji or your hands or a bit of a wave. Thank you very much. Tanja, that was a really, really wonderful and productive talk. And I know there's a couple of questions already in the chat, but I'm just going to start off by taking chair's privilege, if I may. And I know we talked about this just briefly when we spoke last week as well. But obviously what you've drawn for us is, you know, a little bit about your trajectory as a researcher as well, from working on historical materials and then drawing these, you know, really fascinating parallels about what you're doing now. But I wondered if you could just say a bit more about the ethics of jumping to researching the present, using your underpinnings of your historical knowledge, and also that position, you know, your own subjective positioning and how you think around that with the work that you're doing now.
Yeah. So initially, I hadn't really planned this. I mean, perhaps it started in a way actually through a proper research project. I had a project funded by the ESRC, which was about ethnic associations, but in Asia, and it brought my work to now, for starters. So this was in 2014, or that I spent a lot of time for 2 years, most of my time in Asia. I was working with expats, looking at basically how networks work now in Asia, and comparing that to the historical networks. So that was the first, I think, step, because I realized actually, oh, there are so many connections, that just to bring that historical research to now. Now, in terms of the Brexit and EU citizens thing, I have to say, and I've spoken about this before, it's not a secret, I was an activist first. I never set out really to connect these two things. It was not the plan, but the more I was engaged, the more I realized how these connections operated and how they worked. So I decided to discuss this very openly with work, because to be perfectly honest, I felt a bit odd about this. And I think that's fine. And I know there are other academics who are just like this. For I think a lot of our BAME colleagues now, it must be really strange to look the statues debate, because I know a lot of them have been engaged in civil society groups and all sorts of things previously, when they also research these issues. So I would always just, discuss and say, look, I'm really interested in making these connections. Is there anything I might have to bear in mind specifically around ethics and these kinds of things? And so we just kept the conversation going. And if you feel that there might be areas like this where it's a bit blurry, I would recommend you do the same, because that's always the best approach in my experience. You could discuss with your supervisors, or perhaps also if you're working with organizations, sometimes there are more personal links. It's just how the world works. And none of those things are necessarily a problem, but I think it's good to just sort of discuss this. So once they'd said, yeah, that sounds great, we see the parallels, and I had some colleagues read some work where I was making these connections, because for a bit, of course, I thought, well, am I just dreaming this up? It seems quite disconnected on the surface. It was very obvious that it was worth doing this, because it is interesting to me. It offers a new route of bringing that historical research kind of alive in a different way and make it very relevant.
Great, thank you. Just to say as well, I'm going to read out some of the questions now that have come through via the chat. If you have, if any of you have questions or comments that are perhaps a bit more complicated than your fingers can type quickly enough, and you'd like to unmute and say something, put your say so in the chat and I'll bring you in as well. But the first question was from Anna, who asks, you said the Riverside home changed its name. What is it now? Is this the one in Illinois?
Yeah, I saw that now and I thought, crap, of course now I don't remember. There you go. Professors are not perfect. I really should know this. I've got it in another PowerPoint. I will fiddle around and find it. But I can answer another question in the meantime, perhaps.
Yeah, so one from Aulia, I think. So thinking about the ethnic bond among those diasporas in New Zealand, how they could be transformed into citizenship in terms of building New Zealand sporting culture. Is there any challenges faced by recent diasporas to negotiate their identity between host country and homeland?
I think that's always the case, if I'm understanding the question right now. I mean, I've kind of given you a story that sounded very straightforward. It's of course not. There are always these different types of challenges and frictions between places, whether that's homeland, a new place, or between communities as well. Even if you just looked at the Scots, for example, what about Highland Scots who only spoke Gaelic? How were they connected? How did they fit into some of this? So, yes, this is always an issue, I think. I don't know if that really answers the question.
Does the questioner want to jump in and clarify or add anything to that? Or perhaps that's okay. Don't know who that was. You'd need to unmute us though. No? Well,
you can still add it in the chat if I didn't answer your question at all. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, next question from Bissy. Thank you for a fascinating talk. Do you have any plans to look into diaspora groups in Scotland working towards a common goal, such as New Scots and EU Citizens for an Independent Scotland?
That's a really interesting question. So one of the things as part of the This Is Our Home tour that we did still manage to do was have meetings with Ben McPherson, who is the Minister for Immigration, Scottish Government, to present basically a Scottish version of the settled status survey. So I did a report specific to Scotland because some of the results are a little bit different between England and Scotland, and some of those questions came up there. So I am definitely going to continue this work, and there are a number of groups in Scotland that I'm very interested in, and I certainly know, and this comes out from the survey as well, EU citizens describing themselves as New Scots, and with that seems to come particular attitudes to independence. But I think that will require perhaps a second survey or some further work around that, because while there is data in the settled status survey, it's more sort of by accident, I think, rather than by design. So I think I need to understand that a little bit better, and perhaps the diversity of opinion. But there seems to be certainly a link, and it's very interesting because that brings up a whole new range of questions around participation, around collective action, and what action might be taken in different settings.
Great, thank you. And then a question from Christine, who says, thank you. As a returned diasporic Scot myself, I lived in Canada from the ages of 9 to 35. I had a question about your research on associational cultures. While away, I was troubled by the ways in which some sectors of Scottish expat life either imported forms of bigotry from home, sectarian marches, etc., or participated in rhetorics that fed into discourses of white supremacy, particularly evident in colonial spaces like Canada. How did your research shed light on the ways in which diasporic communities can, through their bonds with the homeland, participate in the oppression of the indigenous peoples to whose land they emigrated and or stolen?
Mm-hmm. Can you still hear me, actually? Because I think my screen is frozen.
Oh no, I can hear you fine at the moment. I don't know if that's the same for everyone else.
Anyway, that's grand. It doesn't matter so long as it's still. I was trying to open this file.
It's when you can't see people though.
Yeah, no. It's really weird. So anyway, I'll just keep talking. This is a really important question. It's not a main focus of my work. I must say that straight at the outset, although I did look at it because it's important, because some of the groups did pursue this activity, and individual people as well. If you looked at Scots, for example, one of the stories that always gets to me is the one of someone whose family history in Scotland was one of being forced off the land as part of the Highland clearances, only for him to then pursue the same in New Zealand with Maori people, which seemed particularly strange. I would have perhaps expected that, having had that experience himself, that he might have chosen to do the opposite, basically. But there is a growing body of work on this, which is great, by people who are experts, partly also in Indigenous studies, which I think is even better because they have that background and knowledge as well. I have tried to touch upon it where possible. Associations are for this a problematic focus because the records don't lend themselves to this. So most of the material, where there was any, was perhaps from newspaper reports where there were some reports about issues with individual people or people who were involved, like this politician, where one might find out a few details. But Graham Morton and some others have done some more work on this. So check that out. They are better on this, or stronger on this, because that's their main field rather than on their main. They've worked on it properly. I haven't, basically, necessarily.
Great, thank you, Tanja. Are there any more questions or comments that people would like to make? There's nothing more in the chat at the moment, but if anybody would like to put up their hand and say something. Oh, one just come through, Emanuela. I was wondering if there were also political associations in diaspora communities which tried to defend workers' rights.
Right. There were. It depends a little bit on what immigrant group you're looking at specifically. So, for example, amongst the Germans, this was huge. In fact, they had a whole strand of unionism, effectively, that was built on German roots, and a very German type of unionism. So they have a whole array of associations, specifically, that were effectively unions. In other groups, that's less pronounced. So British Isle groups, I mean, there are some traditions amongst the English, some unionism that ran through and where workers were organized in a specific way, but not as strongly as in some of the other groups, like the Germans, where it certainly in North America was a huge strand. Perhaps language was also a factor there. So you can see some of the differences based on the backgrounds of people.
Great, thank you. Just to say, I know some of you may need to go off to additional sessions starting at 2:30, including my colleagues, but Tanja said she's happy to speak for a little bit longer. So
yeah. Can I just, I've found, just definitely let me say this still, because in fact I could just, couldn't I? Yeah, it's just called Caledonia now. And the reason why I always forget it is it's sort of Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care. I always stumble over this because I think it sounds a bit odd, memory care, because people never quite know what exactly that's meant to mean. But if you Google it, I'm sure you'll find it.
Great, thank you. Adriana wanted to ask a question. Adriana, do you want to unmute yourself, which I think you should be able to do? Oh, yeah, I can see you. Go ahead.
Cool. So thank you, Tanja. This is really interesting. It's really outside of my research area, but it's very much in my kind of personal life area, which is being a Romanian living in the UK. So I was wondering if you're looking at all, or you've looked at all in your research into the cultural effects diasporas have on their communities back home. So when they return with cultural values that they've adopted perhaps in the West or somewhere else, and how that changes.
I haven't really looked at it, but I know that for some communities, this is a big question, and particularly Eastern Europeans actually now, I think. I don't know if you've heard or know, even perhaps from Twitter, if you're on Twitter, Alexandra Bulat by any chance. She is an activist with the 3 Million, but she's also a PhD student, or recently been awarded her PhD. She is a Romanian as well. Check her out, because her research is actually partly on not this question specifically, but includes lots on Romanian, so there might be something in there. I haven't read her whole PhD, but it could be. She's interviewed lots of people here. I mean, even historically though, that's definitely the case. Even if you looked at Highland communities actually, and the impact of connections or ongoing connections with global communities now, it's quite an interesting question, because sometimes it's just about links, but actually, even historically, it was sometimes about bringing money back. And that was perhaps more likely to be, again, these sort of richer type migrants who dispense philanthropy in North America, who were then able to return some money. But there were, I mean, for example, Jardine Matheson, they invested in parts of the Highlands in their local communities. So this is definitely a really interesting question. And at one point I did have a project in mind on sort of return movements, and that wasn't just meant to be about people, but also exactly this question. I then abandoned it because I was awarded the ESRC project, so something else sort of took over, but I'm really interested in it, and I think there are historic precedents to it as well.
Thank you. Tanja, are you okay to just hang on for a few more questions? Yeah, great, fantastic. One from Harriet: did any of the mutual associations in the UK have branches overseas?
There were some that did have sort of branches, or were connected at least. It was also the case though that some of them had, some of the groups I talked about effectively had a global network. So for example, the Royal Society of St. George, which still exists effectively, for a time was sort of an umbrella organization for English groups, different types of English groups, and even some of the mutual groups fell under that. Now that was probably more the sociability sort of focus, but it still serves to illustrate how groups were connected. You know, very often we also found that a new group was set up in, say, South Africa, and it had word for word exactly the same objectives as a group in Toronto, and suddenly you find that one member from Toronto actually had moved to South Africa, and so maybe that's genuinely how, you know, the world was much more globally connected, even if there wasn't necessarily a massive overarching network, although many of them were.
The next question is from James, who's been doing some research twinning associations, and James says they find it interesting how many have been neglected in the lead up to following Brexit. Do you think twinning is still a valuable method of building mutually beneficial citizen advocacy between the UK and Europe?
I would hope so. So when was this? At the end of April, I think. I was in a webinar with a number of MEPs, and this was the newly set up UK-EU friendship group that you may have heard of. And I don't necessarily think the word twinning was expressly mentioned, but certainly, you know, the connections and having to build new types of connections or new ways of connecting. So I would have thought that this is as valuable. It might be interesting for you to actually try and see if they were going to have future webinars and other activities around all sorts of issues about facilitating those links. So it might be interesting for you to try and connect, or at least keep an eye on what they are doing, because they might potentially even look at some of this. Because I certainly know that some of the MEPs involved have previously talked about existing twinning relationships and how they document long-standing connections. So there might well be an interest.
Thank you. A question from Joe, who says, thank you for a wonderful talk. Could you say a little bit about associational culture within Scotland itself? For example, the Island Association formed by Gaels in Glasgow in the 19th century. Would you consider these examples of an internal diaspora within Scotland, or do these associations require a different approach?
No, I consider them exactly the same. In fact, if you were to look at my Clubbing Together book, there is actually a bit on various of these groups. So I think, you know, you might describe this as the near diaspora or a type of internal diasporas. And I think they operate in exactly the same way, pretty much. And especially if it was Gaelic speakers, then of course there was a genuine sort of element of displacement, perhaps. But even if they did speak English, you know, there are various groups in Glasgow and elsewhere in Scotland. And the rules, what they did, it's very similar. So this is one of the interesting questions about diaspora. I don't think it's defined by distance. I think it's defined by these characteristics of groups of people who have moved somewhere. So, you know, movement has to be a part of it, and a certain element of size has to be a part of it, because there aren't just, you know, associations because two people move from A to B. But the characteristics, I think, are overwhelmingly the same. So you could check out and then choose whether you agree or disagree, but you could check out my book, which has quite a bit on exactly that question, basically.
Great, thank you very much. I think we have, oh no, one's just coming through. I can't see who the name of the person that it's from, but saying, among the associations you've researched, have you found any issues of any of these being perceived as fifth columns from competing or enemy states?
No, but that might be because of the time frame I've looked at. I don't know. I mean, I certainly, what might be, I don't know if that answers your question, but what might be interesting to you is my PhD student, Robert Jones is his name. He's written a thesis on the China Association. And I don't know that it qualifies as anything like fifth column, but it brings up a really interesting question about the intersection between politics and these associations, and how suddenly you might get dragged into all sorts of questions that perhaps go way beyond any associational remit. Now with the 3 million, we have the Brexit question, it's a political question. But the China Association, it had MPs in it or former MPs in it, so they were linked up in quite different ways. And suddenly, I think, you know, lobbying, all these kinds of activities, or things that often perhaps happened at these dinners, so there's simply zero record of it. But, you know, it might well be that there were all sorts of things like that. So it doesn't answer your question, but it might go into the direction of what maybe you're interested in. So that might be, if you're trying to find some historical dimension to that, something to maybe look at.
Thank you. Any further, you got a thank you to that response. Any further questions or comments that anybody would like to make? Tanja, I will save, as we discussed at the beginning, I will save the chat for you because there's lots of great, you've probably not been looking at it, but there's lots of great appreciation.
Yeah, just opened it actually, so thank you, it's my pleasure.
I'll save it for you and send it on to you, but I think people have been really, really appreciative of what you've had to say to us today, and so have I very much indeed. It's a kind of wonderful illustration of, you know, kind of that, as I said in my first question, that sort of research trajectory that someone might make, and, you know, bringing those aspects of historical cultural material and cultural research, and how to make, you know, those affinities through your expertise into that kind of broader political sphere, and I think that's really inspiring for a PhD researcher community. So thank you so much for that, really appreciated, and thank you for joining us. Just before we finish up and say a final thank you to you, Tanja, just to remind everybody, or give you a heads up if you don't know, we do have these keynotes continuing for the rest of the week. Tomorrow's talk is going to be actually not a talk but a performance, and I have had a little preview of this, and it is going to be quite something. I think it's going to be a critical cabaret by Karen Fenby-Hultz, who is going to be looking at dismantling the ivory tower, and it's very much set up in cabaret style with songs and performances, so we'll see what that gives. If you haven't yet registered, you can do that via the SAGSA Summer School website, so please do join us for that. And then Priyambada Gopal is speaking on Thursday, then a set of our PhD researchers are speaking on Friday lunchtime to round things out. But just to come back to today and to Tuesday, once again, thanks so much, Tanja. Really appreciated. Wonderful talk, and look forward to having you in Scotland soon.
Thank you very much. And yeah, stay safe, everyone.